Can I call everyone back together for commencement of business, please? And the next item of business is portfolio questions. The first portfolio is Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, and I would remind members that questions 1 and 5 are grouped together. If a member wishes to request a supplementary question, please press the Request to Speak button if they are in the chamber, or if participating remotely, indicate in the chat function by entering the letter R during the relevant question. Some quite detailed questions today, so could we bear in mind to try to be succinct. We go to question number 1, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on its analysis of the Brexit negotiations.
Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the member is aware, I appeared before the Culture and Europe Committee this morning, which he was present, and depressed members there with it, so I don't want to depress her yet again with the same answer, but simply to say that the 4th round of negotiations ended with no discernible progress. The same intractable disagreements remain, and there is no political movement on them. There was a discussion between the Prime Minister and Ursula von der Leyen on Monday, and there was an indication that they wished on both sides to intensify discussions, but with no indication that there was a clarity about how a decision should be reached. Meanwhile, there is a decision by the UK Government to not seek an extension of the transition period, which will be deeply damaging to Scotland.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer, and indeed the news remains as depressing as it was this morning. And to Scotland's extreme misfortune, we are stuck with an extraordinarily reckless UK Tory Prime Minister who we did not vote for, who is furrowed to an ideological political obsession that we do not subscribe to, which will cause untold damage to our economy, to jobs, and indeed to our way of life. Cabinet Secretary, my constituents of Cowdenbeath did not vote to become poorer. Surely there must be a better path for Scotland.
Michael Russell.
There is indeed a better path for Scotland. That is the path of independence, as you are well aware. And of course, the moment I mention that word, there is baying from the Tory and Labour benches. But really what they have to do, there's only one person on the Labour bench, and I would never accuse Sarah Bayek of baying at anybody. It must have been the noise of the Tories must have echoed round the chamber. I just want to make it absolutely clear that anybody who believes that there is still a validity in remaining with the present UK government has a very considerable job of persuasion to do it. Indeed, were they able to do so, they could sell the London Bridge to anybody, anywhere in the world. Because the reality is, when you look at the current situation, you can only come to the conclusion that if a government refuses to accept, as it does, the mandate of the Scottish people, if a Scottish politician, and that is what we're talking about here, with Scottish MSPs, if they refuse to accept the mandate of the Scottish people, what are they doing here?
Question number 5, Beatrice Wishart.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on Brexit negotiations.
Michael Russell.
I can provide an update. There's only a single Tory left in this chamber. Maybe they are creeping away now. The member was present also at the committee this morning and will be aware that my view is that the negotiations are stuck, that there is no political will from the United Kingdom government to deliver anything but a no deal or a low deal. And in these circumstances, there will be severe lasting damage to Scotland were we to allow it to happen.
Beatrice Wishart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. When a no deal became a possibility last year, businesses were asked to prepare. They were told to do what they could to mitigate the impacts in case it became a reality. So should businesses be making no deal preparations now? And if so, are they going to be supported by the Scottish Government to do so?
Michael Russell.
President Officer, Beatrice Wishart raises a very important point. I've indicated in this chamber, I think 2 weeks ago in a statement, that the Scottish Government is reluctantly, but necessarily having to restart its no-deal preparations. It is doing so at the same time that we are faced with the COVID crisis, the worst crisis any of us can have lived through. According, I think, to a front page on the Financial Times, potentially the worst recession since the Ice Fair of 1709, an event at which I was not present, nor indeed was she. So in all these circumstances, we are asking people to do something that will be incredibly difficult. And businesses that are trying to save their own business, trying to save the economy, are meanwhile being penalised by the addition of a type of Brexit which will be immensely damaging. I can no longer take seriously any Conservative who says that they are interested in business if they could, by the stroke of a pen, take that threat away for the next 2 years, which they could do. They could still do so until the end of this month. So what we have to do is to prepare. We will have to talk to businesses about how they prepare. Before the First Minister's statement today, I was involved in a telephone discussion with people involved from the food industry, and everybody now realises that preparation will have to take place. They are looking at it with dread because they're also facing the COVID disaster, and we need to recognise that and try and help as much as we can within our own resources, which are not infinite.
Supplementary from Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased still to be here and still to be standing up for the million-plus people in Scotland who voted for Brexit. Can the Cabinet Secretary just admit honestly for once that he's been keen to sabotage Brexit negotiations since the beginning, and that rather than getting behind the UK's chief negotiator, David Frost, as both sides ramp up negotiations to deliver a good deal, the truth is he just doesn't want Brexit to happen?
Michael Russell.
Well, it is not a blinding revelation to say that I do not want Brexit to happen. I would have thought that that was immensely obvious. But the reality I'm talking about is the type of discussion that we've had with the UK has tried to find a way in which this circle could be squared. I don't believe many people in Scotland, I don't believe hardly anybody in Scotland, would vote for the type of Brexit that is now emerging, not just as a preference of the UK government, but as a decision of the UK government, which is either a no deal or a low deal. I am sure that the constituents of Mr Mundell that voted for Brexit, and some did, not in the majority, just as in Scotland, far from the majority, an overwhelming majority voted against it. But I have 72% of people did not vote for Brexit. If that is, 17,000, apparently Mr Mundell knows each of them, well, he should go and ask.
Excuse me, Mr Russell. Mr Mundell, please don't sit there yelling across the chamber at Mr Russell. It's very discourteous to me, and it's discourteous to those at home who are trying to hear what's going on. If you want that argument, you can have it afterwards. I'm sure Mr Russell would oblige. Michael Russell.
I shall look forward to you managing me in future bouts. Thank you. The reality of the situation is that if Mr Mundell needs to recognise that not all of those 17,000 people voted for the same type of Brexit. Many of them may have voted for the assurances that were given by the current Prime Minister before he was Prime Minister that we would, for example, stay in the single market and the customs union. The reality of the situation is, however, Scotland voted vastly in the majority against Brexit, but is being dragged out of Europe against its will. And it's simply not good enough to repeat, I have to repeat a line I used at the committee this morning. It is really not good enough for Mr Mundell to behave like Citizen Smith and to say to his constituencies, good news, comrade, the butter ration is being cut, because that is what he is doing.
Question number 2, Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ask the Scottish Government what its position is on cooperation with Europe in relation to tackling COVID-19.
Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This Government believes that working closely with our European partners is key in fighting COVID-19, as this disease knows no borders. Indeed, collaboration with international partners to draw on wider international expertise is a key element which we have sought to include in our framework for decision-making in our coronavirus route map. My colleagues and I have been following the measures adopted by the EU in response to the pandemic with great interest, both in relation to the immediate emergency response and the longer-term road to recovery. We are actively engaging with the UK Government in relation to Westminster decisions on engagement with the EU to ensure that our voice is heard.
Neil Bibby.
I thank the Minister for that answer. As the Minister said, no nation will defeat coronavirus alone. This is a global pandemic and we must confront it in cooperation and solidarity with our neighbours and the international community. To that end, will the Minister outline how the authorities in Scotland are cooperating with our other nations in the UK, Europe and around the world in the global drive to find a vaccine? And will she also outline what steps are being taken to secure stockpiles of medicines and pharmaceuticals, given the concurrent threat of Brexit to the security of our supplies?
Jenny Gouras.
I thank Neil Bibby for that question. He's absolutely right. International cooperation has never been more important. So we are liaising with the UK government officials both in Brussels, in business rather, on energy, and in the Department for Health and Social Care on all aspects of the vaccine development, including the work on the COVID-19 Vaccine Task Force and the Joint Committee on Vaccine and Immunisation. And given the range of trials that are currently underway, engagement at a global and at an EU level will be key in supporting any COVID-19 vaccination programme in Scotland. We therefore welcome the launch of the EU strategy for COVID-19 vaccines last Friday and for the confirmation that the UK is eligible to participate. The Scottish Government remains of the view that it is reckless of the UK Government to impose any additional damage on Scotland's economy at this time by refusing to seek an extension to the transition period. We are working closely with the Department for Health and Social Care and other devolved governments to plan for the end of the transition period, including doing all that we can to ensure that we still have access to medicines in the event of border disruption. These plans include contracts with pharmaceutical companies and suppliers on the stockpiling of medicines, which we know will be more challenging given the current circumstances and the impact of COVID-19.
A wee word, these questions and answers are rather long. We're not going to get through all the questions if we keep this up. Question number 3, Sarah Boyack.
To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the issues raised by the global Black Lives Matter protests, what steps it is taking to acknowledge and counter Scotland's historic role in slavery and promote the contribution that can be made through its international development work with Commonwealth countries.
Jenny Gouras.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. During last week's parliamentary debate on anti-racism, the Scottish Government and the entire Chamber were united in our solidarity and our support for the Black Lives Matter movement. While today we are rightly and resolutely focusing on improving the lives of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in Scotland, it is clear that the roots of the entrenched structural racism in our country can be traced back to the abhorrent practice of slavery. As a country, we must acknowledge Scotland's role in the legacy of slavery upon which many of our cities are built, and the motion for debate last week included a commitment to establish a museum to address Scotland's historic links to the slave trade. In terms of international development, we place great importance on Scotland being a good global citizen, which means playing our part in tackling global challenges, including injustice and inequality. We embed human rights and promote a focus on equality across all of our development activity.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I thank the Minister for her reply? I welcome those actions. Minister, at last week's cross-party group on international development, a key issue raised was the negative impact of the pandemic on charities who do fantastic work in developing countries. Given our historic role in slavery and the British Empire, which saw the large-scale extraction of wealth across the world, what will the Scottish Government do to promote and support the work of Scottish charities with Commonwealth countries to eradicate the inequalities that still exist, whether it's lack of clean water or long-term inequalities that need to be addressed?
Jenny Gouras.
Thanks, Sarah Boyack, for that question. COVID-19 has obviously thrown up a number of challenges for all charities, but not least in the sector of international development, as she rightly says. So I've proactively met with some of our key stakeholders in Rwanda and Zambia, and I will shortly meet with those based in Malawi remotely. These conversations have been really helpful in establishing how COVID-19 is impacting people on the ground. And at present, all of our projects are also undertaking their own impact assessments in relation to COVID-19. In terms of local organisations, we obviously fund local charities through our £10 million per year International Development Fund, through the Climate Justice Fund and through the Humanitarian Emergency Fund. And we will also provide core funding to networking organisations to support the international development sector. And on this, I was grateful to meet with the Alliance last week to discuss some of the challenges the sector faces in light of COVID-19. We will continue to work with those charities in the fight against COVID-19, which is of particular importance in the field of international development.
Right. A short supplementary and a short answer, please, from Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The debate about Scotland's role in slavery and human rights needs the full debate, and this week I raised the suggestion of a National Museum for Human Rights to be based in Greenock due to our many historical links to slavery. Is this something that the Minister and the Scottish Government would consider?
Jenny Gouras.
I thank Stuart McMillan for that question. As Greenock's constituency MSP, I understand his interest in this matter and his local area's history. in terms of Scotland's involvement in the slave trade. No decision, however, has yet been taken regarding the location of a National Museum for Human Rights, although he will be aware this was agreed to in last week's debate, as I said earlier. The Scottish Government is engaging with Glasgow University at the moment to take forward work in this area as part of a wider conversation about how we properly acknowledge Scotland's role in the slave trade. And I'll ask officials to keep Stuart McMillan appraised of progress in this area, given his constituency interest.
Question number 4. And we have him here, Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Minister what action is taken to support vulnerable veterans during the COVID-19 outbreak?
Graham Day.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is committed to ensuring that all armed forces personnel, veterans and their families living here are able to access the best possible care and support. And at the time of such uncertainty for so many, we're taking a number of actions, for example, disseminating advice to third sector organisations who are providing direct support to veterans, working closely with Veterans Scotland, ensuring that they have up-to-date information and the latest advice and guidance on the COVID-19 outbreak. And we're supporting the Veterans First Point services who have been proactively working to support veterans during this unprecedented time.
Jeremy Balfour.
I thank the Minister for his answer. I want to focus on young Army veterans who will be looking for future employment out with the armed forces. As you will be aware, many of these people are struggling most to get into employment, and the employment scheme is there to help them. Could the Minister set out how many ex-armed forces personnel have been supported through the Community Jobs Scotland programme, and how the Scottish Government intends to use this programme to get young veterans back into work?
Graham Day.
Presiding Officer, Mr Balfour highlights an extremely important issue, namely that early service leavers and their routes into employment. Alongside supporting the spouses of serving personnel, this is becoming a particular area of focus for the Scottish Government. There have been a total of 37 declared ex-armed forces young people on the Community Jobs Scotland programme since Phase 5, when they were added to the eligible groups. But there will be more early service leavers supported as a result of meeting other eligibility criteria without having declared their services history. During the COVID-19 pandemic, discussions continue between the Scottish Government officials and SCVO about the best interventions to support individuals on the CJS programme. But in addition to the support we offer through that, Skills Development Scotland have undertaken a range of actions to support individuals whose education, job or future choices have been affected. But I would just add finally one small point, Presiding Officer. An immediate pathway into employment won't best serve all early service leavers. For some, moving into education as a means to enhancing future employment prospects might benefit them more. The Scottish Government therefore also looks to offer a range of options to early service leavers in that regard.
Thank you. Now, I really want to get through the last 3 questions, so please be concise. Number 6, Alex Rowley.
To ask the Scottish Government what engagement and discussion it has had with the UK Government in relation to forming a new trade agreements.
Michael Russell.
My colleague Ivan McKee has had extensive discussions, but despite his and the Scottish Government's best efforts, the approach of the UK Government means that the quality and scope of that engagement remains below what is required to ensure that UK trade policy identifies, protects and promotes Scotland's interests. We continue to try to influence that, but quite clearly we could not consent to legislation that would put us in a position of disadvantage.
Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, listening to Donald Trump and his continued commitments for a trade deal, I think many in Scotland are worried that a trade deal will result in reductions on food standards, on workers' rights, on health and safety and ultimately on jobs. Are people right to be concerned about that? And can the Cabinet Secretary say, is our NHS services at risk of a trade deal with the USA?
Michael Russell.
I think the member's point is a very important one. The US Trade Ambassador has made it clear even today that there can, for example, be no trade agreement without access for the US meat industry, and that would mean a lowering of standards. And equally, if that is the position of the US meat industry, it will be the position in other areas. Countries negotiate hard in these matters. So quite clearly the protection we had as a member of the part of a member of the EU, where we could resist that, will be considerably lowered in any case, but it will be completely abandoned if the UK government follow its ideological prejudices and is simply try to have the lowest possible standards. In any case, the US is also saying it's highly unlikely to be a trade deal this year. These trade deals, such as the New Zealand one, the Australian one, the Japanese one, the American one, are chimeras. And they're actually not going to produce anything of great significance. The government's own figures, for example, on the New Zealand trade deal, show that it will have zero impact upon our financially to our benefit. These are important issues, and they are being misrepresented by the UK. We must tell the truth about them.
Question number 7, Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to evidence submitted to the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee stating that over 320 financial services firms have taken steps to relocate to Europe before the end of the Brexit transition period.
Michael Russell.
It is a depressing figure. It indicates the need that those companies have to continue to operate to move at least part of their businesses out of where they're presently located, and is yet more damage to Scotland coming from the process of Brexit. In the face of uncertainty, I fully understand what companies are doing, but I regret it.
Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. The evidence on financial services was given to the committee by Professor Sarah Hall, who also warned that other services, including accountancy, architecture, management consultancy and the media industry, require freedom of movement and automatic recognition of their qualifications post-Brexit. What discussions has the Cabinet Secretary had with representatives of these professions about their concerns regarding the state of the current negotiations?
Michael Russell.
I meet people regularly to talk about the negotiations, and although that has not taken place nearly as regularly in recent months because of the lockdown, I am renewing that now in the light of the severe threat of a no-deal or low-deal Brexit. I have to say the two issues involved are the issue of mutual recognition of qualifications, which is absolutely essential, and again is part of the negotiations, and like negotiations not going well, and this issue of freedom of movement. Freedom of movement has been immensely beneficial to Scotland. How any representative in this chamber could argue for its end completely defeats me, and it affects not simply, though it is extremely important, things like labour in the fruit industry that my colleague Graham Day has taken me to see some time ago, but it actually affects a whole range of professions, as the member has indicated, and those are the professions that will suffer. Our academic reputation, for example, in universities will suffer because of the involvement in research. It is highly to be regretted, and of course Tory support for ending freedom of movement is self-harm for Scotland.
Question number 8, Colin Beattie.
To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it's had with the UK Government regarding the impact of Brexit on EU-UK relations in the light of concerns that any breakdown could have a detrimental impact, including on Scotland, on the response to issues such as the COVID-19 crisis.
Michael Russell.
Well, we have seen, and my colleague Jenny Gilruth has referred to COVID-19 in an earlier question, we have seen actions by the UK government that have not been positive or beneficial in terms of COVID-19, and, for example, the failure to take part in the arrangements for buying PPE. We've seen recently the failure of the UK to take part in a very innocent project that would have given people information about the state of lockdown and the state of openness of borders or otherwise right across Europe. So I have to say I do not think that the actions of the UK government are helping in that regard, and of course they won't help EU-UK relations. I was talking to somebody in Brussels just last week who was saying that there is a palpable sense of anger about the way in which the UK has behaved to date. And that will not improve, and that's not good for our reputation.
Colin Beattie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what he makes of the suggestion by Boris Johnson that a UK-EU deal can be agreed by the end of July?
Michael Russell.
I think I would be very sceptical of that, but of course deals can always be done. The question is, what sort of deal could be done by the end of July? The UK could suddenly say they want to be in the single market and the customs union. I'd agree that, though there would be a lot of work to be done. But what type of deal can be done by the end of July, and how long it takes to implement? So if you do a really, really bad deal and you can't implement it in anything like the period that exists, then that is going to be very problematic indeed. If you have no deal, then quite clearly that would be very bad too. The question is, could there be a good deal for Scotland within that timescale that could also be implemented by the end of the year? The answer to that is an emphatic, clear no.
That concludes portfolio questions on Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. Before we move on to the next one, can I just say I've gone quite a bit over time on that particular slot. Could I ask members and ministers to reflect on the length of questions and answers, because we can't do that on every occasion. So we'll move on to economy, fair work and culture. And I call question number 1, Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update of its plans to safely reopen sectors of the economy.
Jamie Hepburn.
Our route map sets out when different types of work and workplaces are likely to get back up and running. We're working closely with industry, unions and regulators to produce sectoral guidance on how to best do this safely. First Minister's announcement earlier today sets out we intend to move to phase 2 of the route map and included the next steps for businesses in key areas, including manufacturing and retail.
Before you ask your supplementary, Mr Cameron, Mr Hepburn, you were very difficult to hear. Sounded a bit bubbly. I don't know if there's perhaps something wrong with your microphone. If you could do whatever perhaps might help. Donald Cameron.
I thank the Minister for that answer. This morning I was contacted by the owner of a small independent shop in a town in the Highlands who is desperate at not being able to open right now. And in the wake of the First Minister's statement, she now at last does have a date of the 29th of June to work towards. But she nonetheless spoke earlier of her utter despair at not being able to open right away. Does the Minister understand the frustration of many small businesses who have acted responsibly throughout this crisis and yet face being closed for almost 2 further weeks, and for those without an outdoor entrance to their premises, even longer?
Jamie Hepburn.
Yes, of course, I understand the frustrations. I suppose I would go back to the point inherent in Mr Cameron's question, which was about how we go about opening up the economy safely. And everything we are doing, Presiding Officer, is very much geared towards that end. So yes, I understand the frustrations businesses feel, but we are moving forward on the basis that we want to get the economy going, but doing it in a way that protects lives, reduces transmission of COVID-19. So the manner in which we're doing that is the correct one, and I'm sure that Mr Cameron's constituent can now look forward knowing with certainty, greater certainty, that they can reopen in due course.
Short supplementaries, please, from Rhoda Grant and then Kenneth Gibson. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. Thank you, Presiding Officer. A lot of small companies aren't part of sector trade bodies and will need some advice on how they can reopen safely. Can I ask the Minister if he's given this any thought and whether or not a body will be charged with giving that advice to small companies in order to keep themselves and indeed their customers safe?
Jamie Hepburn.
Yes, that is a matter that we are giving attention to. Right now, there is a source of advice on Find Business Support, the website that the Scottish Government operates. I would refer all businesses to that as their first source of information, but we work very closely with the Federation of Small Businesses, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, to be informed by other practical steps we can take, but it is something that we're cognizant of.
Kenneth Gibson.
Minister, it's clear that virtually every sector of the economy, from hospitality to transport and local government to health, will need additional funds this financial year. Whilst figures cannot be precise at this stage, is there a minimum figure of additional resources that the Scottish Government will require to deal with the pandemic and Brexit transition without having to cut services or impose austerity?
Jamie Hepburn.
Well, I thank Mr Gibson for the question, of course. Right at the outset of responding to this crisis, we've expended significant resource, over £2 billion, to support the businesses. As we've moved forward, we've looked at gaps in provision and rolled out wider forms of support. And these are matters we will, of course, keep under constant review. So Mr Gibson can be assured that we're alert to these issues and we continue to look at them.
Question number 2, Gillian Martin.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government how it plans to respond to the loss of oil and gas jobs in the North East.
Fiona Hislop.
Last week, we committed over £60 million in an energy transition fund, which is North East focused and will support businesses to diversify and support inclusive growth. The Oil and Gas and Energy Transition Strategic Leadership Group, chaired by Paul Wheelhouse, has also been refocused and is now meeting monthly, working with Oil and Gas UK, OGA, trade unions and employers to identify practical actions to support the sector, its supply chain and, most crucially, the workforce. The UK Government retains many of the key levers required, including delivery of an oil and gas sector deal. It is critical that both governments are doing all that we can to protect jobs and retain vital skills.
Gillian Martin.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and she'll know that I'm on record as calling for a resumption in the Transition Training Fund. Yesterday, whilst in the COVID-19 committee, I was joined in that call by Scottish Renewables to reinstitute the fund, but with a focus on retraining for redeployment to the renewable sector. What is the Cabinet Secretary's response to those calls?
Fiona Hislop. It's very important that our recovery is a green recovery, and that will also require skills, and as part of that just transition support for those reskilling into that area. If I can reassure the member that only yesterday, along with the Deputy First Minister and Richard Lockhead and Jamie Hepburn, we met with the chairs and chief executives of Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council, their chairs and chief executives, to discuss support and training that will be required for what will be a substantial labour market response. And clearly regional support for regional jobs must be identified as a key priority, and I think for the North East that most definitely is in the area that she described.
Short supplementaries, please. Lewis MacDonald and then Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will know that the Curlew floating production and storage vessel is now to be decommissioned in Norway after sitting for several months in Dundee. Given this work could have been done by any of a number of Scottish yards had they been given the opportunity to tender, can she tell us what engagement there has been with Shell and Exxon on decommissioning over recent months?
Fiona Hislop.
Well, Paul Wheelhouse, as the Energy Minister, is actively engaged with all the oil companies and indeed looking at some of the issues and particularly the work sources on that. That's some of the areas that the Oil and Gas and Energy Transition Strategic Leadership Group that he chairs have been looking at. But clearly it's absolutely essential that we position ourselves to ensure that we can get those contracts that are available in relation to decommissioning, and that is something that, as the relatively new Economy Secretary, I'm determined to do.
Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question follows on from the previous one. While it's important that the workforce are reskilled and ready for new opportunities, I was going to ask what the Scottish Government is doing to ensure that decommissioning work that could come to Scottish ports like Lerwick actually does.
Fiona Hislop.
Again, I would refer the member to the portfolio that has energy as part of that. That's the transport infrastructure, and Paul Wheelhouse is the lead for that. I will try and ensure that he can respond a bit more detail to those questions in his portfolio area. But I can say that decommissioning is something that Scotland can and should be ahead of, because our experience, obviously, in this area in the oil and gas sector itself. But in terms of decommissioning, it's vital that we try and get the opportunities to have that. But we need to have the supply chain companies, and we need to have people with the skills to ensure that that can be delivered. And that's why a regionally responsive solution to a green recovery will be helpful for those wanting to advance the decommissioning sector itself.
Short supplementary, please. Alexander Burnett.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. We welcome the £62 million Energy Transition Fund from the Scottish Government, and we're particularly grateful for the fund which will position the North East as a hydrogen model region, which the Scottish Conservatives have been calling for some time. The Cabinet Secretary set out when we can expect for further detail of when this money will be distributed and how the projects will be funded.
Fiona Hislop.
Well, when I announced it just over a week ago, we set out there what the different areas would be supported from the fund. The Energy Transition Zone, the Oil and Gas Technology Net Zero Solutions Centre, Global Underwater Hub, also hydrogen and carbon capture, utilisation and storage projects. The member will recall that it was the Conservative government that cancelled in 2015 the carbon capture, utilisation and storage at Peterhead. And had that gone ahead, we would be far, far ahead in renewable energy and, most importantly, in some of the areas on hydrogen in particular. So it's really important that the Conservatives get behind this, and let's see the proposals coming forward, which I would welcome, for an oil and gas deal, which I expect to see from the UK Government.
Question number 3, Annie Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what economic impact of COVID-19 has been on businesses occupying shared premises.
Jamie Hepburn. Looks like we've lost Jamie Hepburn. Oh, no, here he comes. Yeah, Jamie
Hepburn. Again, then, Presiding Officer. COVID-19 is having an unprecedented economic impact on businesses across all sectors of the economy. We are doing all we can to provide support for businesses to help protect jobs, prevent business closure and promote economic recovery. As part of this, on the 8th of June, we expanded the Coronavirus Business Support Fund in response to feedback from business. Small businesses that lease or rent space, such as shared office space, business incubators and shared industrial units from a landlord who is the registered ratepayer for the property, can now apply for a small business grant. Businesses that meet the eligibility criteria can apply to the local authority until the 10th of July.
Annie Wells.
The Scottish Government have again moved the goalposts. Are they actually trying to help? This is pathetic. That's what a small business owner at the Forge Market wrote to me about the SNP's false promises and grant support. Numerous others have been in touch to ask why they're having to jump through hoops that other businesses didn't have to, including providing evidence that they have multiple staff members and the use of a business bank account. What does the Minister have to say to those businesses at the Forge Market who feel totally let down?
Jamie Hepburn.
Well, the first thing I would say, President Officer, is I reject the notion that we've moved the goalposts. What we've done is we've engaged with business organisations. We've heard very clearly about the need to fill a gap that existed before. That's precisely what we've announced with this form of scheme. In relation to the difference in approach, of course, this is a different cohort of business. So previously, it was more straightforward because businesses were registered as being eligible for the small business bonus scheme. Clearly, in this instance, that's not the case. So it's necessary to have some form of evidence having to be provided to prevent any form of people drawing down support they're not entitled to. I recognise that it creates a step that businesses have to take, but it's the proportionate and sensible thing to do, because after all, we are talking about public funds here, Presiding Officer.
Question number 4, Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the economic impact on retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, what discussions the Economy Secretary has had with the UK Government regarding the £51,000 rateable value ceiling on eligibility for the £25,000 support grant.
Fiona Hislop.
We have always been clear that we are passing on every penny of consequential funding that has come to Scotland. The package of support in Scotland now exceeds £2.3 billion, which is more than the consequentials we received from the UK Government. I raised the issue of the £51,000 rateable value threshold, which is the same in England, with the Chancellor in an economy meeting a number of weeks ago. And last week, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism wrote jointly to the Chancellor on this issue.
Christine Graham.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for answer. Cabinet Secretary, I'm not doing much better. Despite writing to the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, in case people don't know who he is, asking him to raise the 51,000 rates barrier to accessing this grant with the consequential funding for Scotland to protect iconic rural hotels such as the Peebles Hydro, I'm yet to receive even an acknowledgement. Cabinet Secretary, should I continue to pin my hopes on him helping the hospitality sector in Scotland, or resign myself to the fact that he is not Scotland's man in the UK Cabinet, but the UK Cabinet's man in Scotland?
That was the Deputy Presiding Officer showing everybody how short questions should be asked. Fiona Hislop.
My frustration on this, I think, is shared by those in the hospitality industry. It was obviously a clear route to help support those that had 51,000k rateable value. What we have done in the meantime is to identify specific funds unique to Scotland, of the Creative Hospitality and Tourism Fund and also the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund, both of which have provided funding to many, many hotels, the length and breadth of Scotland, whether it's the Auchrani Hotel in Mr Gibson's constituency or the Selkirk Arms or right across Scotland. However, unless we can get some additional support from the UK Government, it becomes increasingly problematic. I would say that for the hospitality sector and for tourism generally, an extension of the job retention scheme would help those hotels that she asked for. As to her remarks about the Secretary of State for Scotland, I think she was very focused as to whether he's actually standing up for Scotland's interests. If he was, he would be pressing the interests of tourism and hospitality and getting results. So far, there aren't any results.
Question number 5, Maurice Golden.
To ask the Scottish Government what priorities will guide its plans for a green economic recovery.
Fiona Hislop. Green recovery is one that is aligned to our ambitious climate change targets and our vision of a just, sustainable, resilient Scotland. It will seek to address the twin challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. Our plans for a green recovery will be informed by advice from several groups, including the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, the UK Committee on Climate Change, the Just Transition Commission and the Sustainable Renewable Advisory Group.
Maurice Golden.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. A genuinely green recovery must mean associated manufacturing jobs stop going abroad instead of to Scottish workers. The SNP have been planning for a deposit return scheme for over a decade. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether the deposit return scheme vending machines will be built here in Scotland?
Fiona Hislop.
So the deposit return scheme is the responsibility of my colleague Rosanna Cunningham. We know that there's some concerns, particularly around retail and hospitality and other areas in terms of the rollout of that. So there has been pauses in that. I don't know the details of who will be manufacturing the relevant machines, but I will ask my colleague Rosanna Cunningham to write to him on that regard.
Short supplementary from Willie Rennie.
Why is it cheaper to construct huge jackets for the Seagreen offshore wind farm? It's cheaper to build them on the other side of the planet than it is here. What are we not getting right in this country that this happens?
Fiona Hislop.
The contracts for the Seagreen project have yet to be announced. What I can say is that we are determined to make sure that Scotland does have a supply chain that can compete. One of the real issues that we have, however, is the current UK government's reliance on a contract for difference, which doesn't allow us to position Scotland's manufacturing base as a competitive position as other countries who can have far more opportunities, for example, to subsidise or support their industry to produce jackets in the cheap way that he has described. For example, in China, he will know the economy of China, heavily subsidised its steel industry, and obviously steel as a major component means that obviously in terms of contracting, some countries can be cheaper than other countries.
Question number 6, Neil Finlay.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to encourage employers and unions across major economic sectors to engage in national collective bargaining.
Jamie Hepburn.
We have been working with the STUC and other stakeholders to promote collective bargaining. We are focusing initially on social care, early learning and childcare, hospitality and the construction sectors. A mapping exercise is underway to determine current collective bargaining, national and sectoral agreements across Scotland, which will inform further work to increase Scotland's collective bargaining coverage. To promoting collective bargaining is demonstrated through the inclusion of an employee voice indicator within the national performance.
Neil Finlay.
To Everyone will know that trade unions have played a vital role in maintaining jobs throughout the COVID crisis, also negotiating business and employee support and keeping workers and customers safe. It's now time to proactively move to establish frameworks and sectors where the Scottish Government have major spending power and influence. During the emergency legislation, the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution said it was impossible to set up collective bargaining in the social care sector, which of course was rubbish. But since we are past that COVID legislation, will the Minister now commit to moving beyond discussions and papers going back and forward to actual hard practical steps to establish a system of national collective bargaining in the private social care sector?
Jamie Hepburn.
Let me first of all, Presiding Officer, concur with Mr Finlay in the vital role that trade unions played throughout the current period. I've, along with the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, been working very closely with the STC and unions over the current period, and they have been essential in that regard. In relation to Mr Finlay's point, what I have just laid out are concrete steps to try and to take this forward. So we are working very closely with trade unions to understand the gaps that exist in terms of collective bargaining. Will continue to take that forward. This is a sincere and genuine commitment. There are clearly limitations in the sense that we don't have control over employment law, but we're not letting that act as a barrier. We will get on with this work, and we will work to increase collective bargaining across country.
Question number 7, Claire Baker.
To ask the Scottish Government what support is being provided to the theatre sector during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Fiona Hislop.
The Scottish Government has made available a range of funds, including the £120 million Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund and the £30 million through the Culture, Tourism and Hospitality Enterprises Hardship Fund. The approach taken by these funds is unique to Scotland. A number of theatres have received support through these routes. I met with the Federation of Scottish Theatres on the 11th of June and pledged to continue to work with them to consider the best way to continue supporting the sector through the crisis.
Claire Baker.
The Cabinet Secretary will have seen the report this week from Oxford Economics on the projected economic impact of COVID-19 on the creative industries, which states that Scotland will be the hardest hit in relative terms, with Scottish respondents the most pessimistic about the 2020 outlook. The Lyceum Theatre and the Pitlochry Theatre are proposing redundancies, and many theatres are cancelling their Christmas programmes, which is often a financial lifeline. I am pleased the Cabinet Secretary has met with the Scottish Theatres Federation recently, and will she commit to work with others to deliver a medium and long-term creative arts recovery package for the performing sector, recognising the challenges it faces and that are longer lasting and potentially devastating?
Fiona Hislop.
I thank the member for raising this absolutely critical issue. Clearly, as I've announced, we've provided support in the short term, but what the theatre sector particularly needs is the medium to long term, because obviously they're having to look at far forward in terms of their programming and what they can do. Individual theatres that are independent will have to take their own steps. In fact, the ones that are suffered the most are the ones that have actually been mostly commercially supported, and rather than those by public funds. And it's not just the buildings, it's how they can come back safely. And we're looking and already working with guidance for these areas, the creative sector in particular. But there's also the people who work there, and obviously freelancers are very much attached to the theatre world, and there is something about in the longer term how we can help those freelancers to the point in time where they can be re-employed. I've already raised with the UK Government thoughts about having some kind of freelance retainer scheme, for example, for the theatre sector that would stretch beyond October, because although some organisations can take advantage of the job retention scheme, we are looking into the autumn for many of these areas. So I want to work with everybody and MD on this, and including Claire Baker, because I think we've got a particular interest here. The creative industries is a very successful part of Scotland, probably disproportionately more successful than perhaps outside London, the rest of the UK. So that's why it hits us even further. So we were very rapid in our response, but I acknowledge that more will have to be done in the medium to long term.
Short supplementary, please, from Gordon MacDonald.
Many artists, performers and venues will have been adversely affected as a result of the Edinburgh Fringe being cancelled this summer due to the coronavirus, the first time it's taken place since it began more than 70 years ago. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on the steps the Scottish Government is taking to mitigate the impact?
Clearly, cancelling this year's Fringe was a great disappointment to many. It was obviously a very difficult decision that will be sorely missed. We have provided a £1 million interest-free loan to the Fringe, which has been warmly welcomed by them. They also received funding from the Resilience Fund, and they also received support from Edinburgh Council. It is really important that we provide as much flexibility from existing funds. So, for example, the existing Expo and Place Fund have been used not just by the Fringe but other festivals to make sure that they can maintain their sustainability. And I think the rapid decisions that we took have helped to ensure that these festivals will return and return again next year. But in the meantime, can I thank them and everybody involved for helping keep Scotland safe by ensuring that unfortunately they had to cancel this year's Festival and Fringe.
Question number 8, Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what support it is offering to the live music festival sector to support the return of such events in 2021.
Fiona Hislop.
The Scottish Government recognises that the restrictions required to control the virus have had a devastating impact on live music festivals and indeed the entire event sector in Scotland. Businesses in the music festival sector will have been able to apply for support from the Resilience Fund and indeed the Creative Hardship Fund. But we recognise that these support packages cannot help everyone, and we are working with the Events Industry Advisory Group, on which the festival sector is represented, to identify what additional support would help recovery. The sector provides a major contribution to Scotland's cultural life and to our economy, and we are determined that it will rebound strongly from the current crisis.
Ian Gray.
I thank the Minister for that answer, and can I ask her, in her consideration, that she ensures that what support is available isn't only available to high-profile national music festivals, but also to important local ones, for example, Fringe by the Sea in North Berwick, Hadstock in Haddington, or the Lammermuir Festival across East Lothian.
Fiona Hislop.
I don't think we can underestimate the power of culture to help drive us through this very difficult time, and I think local festivals are particularly important. From the Creative Scotland's perspective, they've ensured that the regularly funded organisations, many of whom have small local festivals involved, and that funding for 2020 has been extended to allow them to return in 2021. And indeed, they're also encouraging those festivals to honour contracted payments to freelance performers who've booked for 2020. Some are negotiating part payment now and part payment for 2021. But as he clearly points out, not all of these festivals will be funded by Creative Scotland. So we have to look at things in the round. And similarly, as expressed to Claire Baker, the entertainment, the cultural sector is one that is going to be hit hardest and longest, and therefore needs more longer-term support. So the temporary support that's in place just now will help for this summer, but I think there's a longer lead-in period, and some of those festivals don't necessarily take place in the summer.
That concludes the portfolio questions on economy, fair work and culture. Again, I allowed it to run on a bit. There's an awful lot of very important questions that have been coming up today. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for Education for his forbearance and our lateness. And we now move on to education and skills. And question number 1 is from Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what support it is providing to young people and parents across Dumfries and Galloway to assist with education at home during COVID-19 lockdown.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, responsibility for education rests with local authorities. However, the Scottish Government has published a range of COVID-19 guidance documents to assist local authorities during the current period. We provide practical advice and support through the Parent Club Scotland and Parent Zone Scotland websites, through Education Scotland's New Scotland Learns initiative, and through Education Scotland's support for GLOW, the online learning platform. Pupil equity funding is available to address the poverty-related attainment gap. Schools in Dumfries and Galloway will receive £137,343 in 2020-21 via the Attainment Challenge Schools programme.
Emma Harper.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. It's been brought to my attention that some families across Dumfries and Galloway don't have access to the internet in their homes, particularly people from areas of lower incomes. and they're struggling to educate their children at home, and it's causing a lot of stress for both the young people and the parents. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what options the Scottish Government is able to put in place to allow for access to the internet, such as the BT scheme that allows 6 months free access to the internet in England?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, there has been a lot of good work undertaken by individual schools to try to support young people who don't have digital access to enable them to do so, and there have been numerous examples around the country where that has been put in place. We understand the challenges that learners may face while undertaking learning at home, including those challenges that Emma Harper referred to in relation to internet access. The Government has announced we're investing £9 million, which will deliver 25,000 laptops with internet access provided where required for children who experience disadvantage to support learning outside school. This is part of our £30 million commitment to support digital inclusion. The guidance that is also available from the Government in relation to education during Term 4 places a heavy emphasis on the importance of directly supporting the core elements of the curriculum to assist young people in sustaining their learning during this period of disruption.
And supplementary from Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In Dumfries and Galloway and across Scotland, plans have been put in place for blended learning, which will mean, of course, teachers teaching one cohort part of the week, another cohort the rest of the week, while the first group of pupils study at home, so teachers won't be available to support home learning in the way that they have been. Is there not a role here for Education Scotland to become much more engaged in providing and indeed delivering a national curriculum for home learning?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, if you would indulge me, Presiding Officer, I learned earlier on today that Mr Gray has announced, I don't quite think it's his retirement, but his decision not to seek re-election to Parliament after the election. And I take this opportunity to wish him well and to acknowledge the formidable contribution he has made to Parliament. He and I were elected on the same day in 1999 to the first Scottish Parliament, and he's made a distinguished contribution since then, and I'm sure will continue to do so until the election in the spring. In relation to the substance of Mr Gray's question, I fundamentally agree with him. The Education Scotland is working with eSchool, which is the Collier and Neil Share digital learning platform, which the Government has funded historically to enable learning to be shared across the challenging geography of the Western Isles. We are now working across the whole of Scotland with eSchool to create the availability of learning, particularly for the senior phase, which will enable any young person in Scotland to be able to access digital learning in a number of different areas in the senior phase to enhance in-school learning, which we are working to maximise. So Education Scotland is working on that. It is also delivering the Scotland Learns proposition, which is contained within the Education Scotland website, which provides weekly educational materials to support digital learning at home.
Question number 2, Stuart Stevenson.
To ask the Scottish Government what work is being undertaken to ensure that young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds are not digitally excluded while learning from home.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, we recognise that digital technology will play a key role in delivering continuity of education, and that this is likely to be a key issue for some of our more disadvantaged families, children and young people. We do not wish to see children and young people in any part of the country left without access to usable devices or connectivity solutions in these exceptional circumstances. That is why we have committed to investing £30 million in digital devices and connectivity to provide that extra help to young people who don't currently have access to appropriate technology.
Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that answer. We heard yesterday in committee of Highland Council's provision of Chromebooks for, I think, all their pupils. Given that local authorities are a key part of delivering educational provision. How is the government working with councils across Scotland, in particular to ensure that the return to school in August is ready for the blended learning that will then follow?
John Swinney.
The government is working closely with local authorities. Our local authorities are joint partners with us in the Education Recovery Group and have designed the approach to blended learning, which is being pursued by schools around the country. So we work closely with local authorities. Currently, the plans that have been developed by local authorities are being assessed by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Education to ensure that all aspects of the opportunities to maximise face-to-face learning have been taken and to ensure that the models in place are appropriate. That dialogue is ongoing. What will flow from that will be the identification of the requirement for resources to ensure that that capacity can be maximised, and the government will engage constructively in that exercise in that respect. Specifically in relation to the question of digital learning, which was at the heart of Mr Stevenson's original question, the government is engaged with local authorities in identifying young people who will benefit from access to digital resources and devices and connectivity, and that will influence the way in which we distribute digital technology in the future.
Short supplementary, please, from Jamie Green.
Thank you. Digital learning needs more than laptops, it needs lessons. And in the poll of parents in the National Parent Forum Q&A, which I know the Cabinet Secretary participated in the other night, only a third said that children had received live or recorded lessons, and 60% had no virtual contact with teachers at all these past 3 months. How can we have any faith in blended learning if we haven't got it right so far?
John Swinney.
I think that obviously that was a particular poll of a particular gathering of people on that on the Q&A session. I'd also say to Mr Green that there's other evidence which was published by the Connect organisation, which is the a parents' organisation, which over the course of lockdown indicated a growing level of satisfaction amongst parents about the volume and quality of learning support which had been delivered by schools to young people. Indeed, in that last survey, only 8% of parents indicated dissatisfaction with the level of support that was available. Now, 8% is too high for my liking, but I think it's an indication of the fact that in the overwhelming majority of cases, schools have worked extremely hard to make sure they put in place the learning materials and support and lessons which can support the learning of young people when they are at home.
Questions 3 and 4 have been grouped. Question number 3, Keith Brown.
To answer Scottish Government how issues relating to racism are addressed within the Scottish education system.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, helping children and young people to develop as responsible global citizens is a key feature of the curriculum in schools in Scotland. Learning about current and past attitudes and values and historical events and their impact on society today is a key element of the curriculum. We all need to be vigilant in challenging any racist and abusive behaviour in our schools. Where it occurs, it must be challenged through educating children about all faiths and belief systems and ensuring they learn tolerance, respect and equality, as well as healthy relationships.
Keith Brown.
I thank the Deputy First Minister for his answer. He will be aware that the strength of feeling here in Scotland is substantial following the Black Lives Matter protests and of the need to face up to a colonial past. Many schools are making efforts to introduce anti-racism learning, like Alva Academy in my constituency, which has been awarded the status of a vision school for Holocaust education. While I accept, of course, that dealing with the coronavirus pandemic is the overriding concern, will the Deputy First Minister consider how the Scottish Government can further encourage diversification in the curriculum so that Scottish children are fully aware of Scotland's past history, not least including its shameful role in slavery and colonisation?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, let me begin my response to Mr Brown by congratulating Alva Academy on the prestigious award that it has achieved in relation to its status as a vision school for Holocaust education. I had the pleasure of discussing a range of issues around education with head teachers from Clackmannan local authority area just on Tuesday, and Scott McEwen, the head teacher of Alva Academy, was one of the participants in that discussion. So it is a great credit to Alva Academy that it has achieved this status. While Scotland's curriculum is not prescriptive, it provides teachers with a flexible framework through the experiences and outcomes contained in Curriculum for Excellence. This allows teachers and schools to teach what is appropriate for their learners in their own classroom, school and local authority. Teaching materials exist on Education Scotland's National Improvement Hub to support the teaching about slavery, and there are opportunities through the experiences and outcomes of social studies to teach about Black history. But acknowledging the significance of the issues that have been raised by the Black Lives Matter issue, I intend to look afresh at these questions to ensure that the guidance and the material in the experiences and outcomes adequately addresses the point that Mr Brown has raised today.
Question number 4, John Mason.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the Black Lives Matter campaign, how dealing with racism and Scotland's links with slavery are taught in schools.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, diversity, equality and respect for others are at the heart of policies supporting school education in Scotland. Learning about current and past attitudes, values and historical events and their impact on society today forms part of the curriculum in Scottish schools. The Curriculum for Excellence experiences and outcomes provide opportunities to teach Black history by exploring a variety of issues including slavery, human trafficking and exploitation. In addition, the study of slavery can form part of National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher History National Qualification courses.
John Mason.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. At the weekend, I was listening to someone speak about his experience growing up in Scotland as a mixed race or biracial young person. And I think some of these folk can face particular challenges in our schools and elsewhere. Is there adequate support, does the Cabinet Secretary think, for young people in our schools?
John Swinney.
I think the fundamental answer to Mr Mason's question must be in the application of the values at the heart of our curriculum, which are the values that are engraved on the mace in front of the presiding officer: wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity. These values lie at the heart of Scotland's curriculum. And we look to schools to take those values and to ensure they are instilled and reflected in the ethos of individual schools. Now, I'm not doing it just now, but I spend, for obvious reasons, but I spend a vast amount of my time in individual schools around the country. And what I see at first hand is that translation of those values from our mace here in Parliament into the ethos and the values of individual schools, where many of the questions that Mr Mason fairly raises with me can be confronted to make sure that young people have an experience that educates them and equips them to address and to handle and to respect the diversity that exists within our society, which must be part of the ethos of individual schools, because it must be part of the ethos of our society. And learning about what leads to and what prompts the disgraceful events that we saw in George Square in Glasgow last night is an important part of the current appreciation that young people must understand about our education within our education system.
Question number 5, Pauline McNeill.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it plans to provide targeted support to 16 to 24-year-olds who have been shielding during the COVID-19 lockdown to help them gain employment.
Jamie Hepburn.
I recognise that this is an extremely challenging time for young people who are considering their options of whether to remain in education, training or enter the labour market, particularly those in the most vulnerable categories, including those shielding as a result of COVID-19. We have a strong track record of reducing youth unemployment through our internationally recognised Developing Young Workforce programme. In the coming weeks, we will outline a series of measures that have been developed in partnership with employers, which will support all young people in making informed decisions regarding their employment options.
Pauline McNeill.
Presiding Officer, A mother in my constituency wrote to me this week about her 17-year-old son who's shielding. He works in a Glasgow hotel. He's likely to be made redundant, but this is the important point. He cannot attend a job interview and is unlikely to be able to do anytime soon because he's shielding. Paul Johnson of the Institute of Fiscal Studies highlighted that periods of unemployment whilst young can have long-term effects. Now, I hope the Minister doesn't mind too much if I am direct with him. I previously have had answers that have said that the budget for Skills Development Scotland is going to increase by 30 million and so on. It's quite meaningless to a young person in that situation. And I asked them to think very seriously that maybe a different approach might be more helpful. For example, writing to all young people who are shielded. They are an extremely vulnerable group right now. Aileen Campbell said she would feed that back when I raised it last week. I wonder if she's had time to, and if you could comment. Thank you.
Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you to Pauline McNeill for the question. Presiding Officer, let me in the first instance say I'm obviously very sorry to hear about the young person who has been in touch with Pauline McNeill very directly. Let me say to her very clearly and very directly as she spoke to me, I recognise the scale of the challenge that is confronting us, and in utilising the significant resource that we deploy in our skills and education system, we recognise the need to do things differently to make sure that we have that ever more person-centred, person-focused approach to the provision of skills and training. That's always been my ambition for our system, and the necessity of it is exacerbated even more. I think her suggestion is a very good one, and I will certainly take that away and see if that's something that we can deploy. If it's something we can do, then I'll be very happy to see how we take that forward.
Question number 6, James Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to ensure the SQA grading process is fair and transparent.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, fairness has to be delivered for all learners in the absence of the 2020 exam diet, and the Chief Examiner has set out that fairness is one of the 3 core principles upon which the Scottish Qualifications Authority is approaching the awarding of qualifications in this extraordinary year. The SQA has reaffirmed its commitment to transparency and fairness and is committed to publishing its completed equality impact assessment and the details of its approach to certification this year.
James Kelly.
Can I thank the Deputy First Minister for that answer? As the Deputy First Minister, I appreciate the process of grading for many young people throughout Scotland is a very stressful and worrying time. And it's important that our young pupils are able to achieve the maximum grades possible, consistent with their abilities. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister for a categoric assurance that those who stay in areas of social deprivation or in schools whose performance has dipped previously will not have any detrimental effect on the grades that they are awarded?
John Swinney.
I think the points that Mr Kelly raises are very important points. I acknowledge that this is the examination and certification process any year is a stressful process. I accept that in these conditions it is ever more stressful for young people. It is absolutely essential, and I am assured by the Scottish Qualifications Authority that the issues about which Mr Kelly has raised are properly and fully taken into account in the circumstances and the approaches that they are taking to make sure that no young person is disadvantaged because of where they come from and what their circumstances have been. Young people should be judged on their ability and their talents, and I'm assured that that's what the certification system will do this year.
Short supplementary, please. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what his expectations are in terms of volumes of appeals and potential for any delays that may result? He'll be aware that timing will be important in terms of university and college admissions. So is he confident that there will be the capacity to deliver these appeals on time?
John Swinney.
I think it's difficult for me to predict the volume of appeals because the certification process is not yet being completed. But the SQA has developed the appeals process. They will obviously be relying upon the contribution of teachers to that appeals process, which is an essential part of the work that is undertaken, and the capacity must be in place to make sure, as I answered Mr Kelly, to ensure that no young person suffers any disadvantage as a consequence of the circumstances that we are facing.
Question number 7, Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how blended learning will take account of families with more than one child.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government maintains a strong focus on excellence and equity for all children within the necessary constraints of the COVID-19 response. Learning will be developed locally by schools, taking account of the local circumstances of children and their families to ensure that the needs of every learner are met in the circumstances that we face.
Mark Griffin.
I thank the Deputy First Minister for that answer. Families would like to see schools return full-time as soon as safely possible, but blended learning is in place. What guidance will the Scottish Government issue to make sure families with more than one child have all children in school on the same days, giving parents certainty they'll be able to return to work at least part-time?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, let me agree with the first part of Mr Griffin's question, which is that the desire to return to full-time formal schooling is at the heart of our plans and our expectations, and we will get to that point as early as it is safe for us to do so. The second part of Mr Griffin's question is an important point which I know local authorities are trying to address to ensure that where there are siblings at the same school, they can be placed in the same cohorts to ensure there is certainty and assurance for individual families. And I know that work has been taken forward at a very practical level by local authorities to ensure the points that Mr Griffin has raised can be fully and properly addressed.
Question number 8, Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what additional guidance and resources it is providing to local authorities to support the implementation of blended schooling.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government established the COVID-19 Education Recovery Group to bring together partners and stakeholders to ensure that delivery of education, including a model of blended learning, maintains a strong focus on excellence and equity for all within the necessary constraints of the COVID-19 response. Education Scotland is providing a range of guidance and resources to teachers, schools and local authorities to support the implementation of blended learning. And as I indicated in earlier responses, the Government is discussing issues of financial resources with local authorities as a consequence of the models being developed.
Maureen Watt.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I've been contacted by parents concerned with how the model may affect key workers and their ability to care for their children on the days when they're not at school. Can the Scottish Government give assurances that they are aware of these challenges and will continue to work with key organisations such as the National Parent Forum Scotland as we navigate through this lockdown?
John Swinney.
Yes, I can give that assurance, Presiding Officer. The Government appreciates the challenges that parents face. That's why we have put in place the resources that we have. It's why we are trying to ensure that all measures are taken to restore formal education, formal schooling, as early as we possibly can do. And we work actively with the National Parent Forum for Scotland, who have produced a lot of good materials and contribution. They are, of course, partners in the Education Recovery Group to ensure that the views and concerns and issues that parents have can be properly and fully addressed in the model that we take forward.
That concludes the portfolio questions in education and skills. Thank you very much, everyone. There are no questions to be put as a result of today's business at decision time, to which we now come. So that concludes decision time. And this meeting is closed.